Imagine this. You're simply minding your own business when suddenly a stranger demands your personal information. When you refuse, she picks up the phone and calls the police, accusing you of something you didn't even do. This isn't a scene from a movie. This is a reality that countless black men face. Stay tuned to uncover the shocking truth behind why one Karen decided to call 911 on a black man just for standing up for his rights. In a world where personal boundaries are often tested and privacy is increasingly under siege, one's right to refuse sharing personal information is becoming more and more significant. This is particularly true when it comes to issues of race, where people of color frequently find themselves in situations where their boundaries are not respected. This story revolves around a black man who, through a simple act of self-preservation, refusing to share his personal details with a stranger, becomes the target of an unjustified 911 call. What starts as an innocuous refusal escalates into a much larger issue, revealing not just personal prejudice, but societal tensions that continue to fuel discrimination and injustice. The significance of this incident lies not in the refusal itself, but in what happens afterward. In a time when personal rights and freedoms are more important than ever, how easily one's refusal to comply with a stranger's request can lead to an escalation that places their safety at risk is a stark reminder of the challenges people of color often face. This is a reality far too many encounter daily, yet it remains largely unnoticed, especially when the consequences are far-reaching. What's even more alarming is the response that follows: an immediate call to 911, a decision to involve the authorities simply because the black man refused to give in to the demand of a stranger. The woman involved, instead of accepting the refusal as a personal choice, escalates the situation to a potentially dangerous level. It becomes a confrontation based on assumptions, racial biases, and an unfounded sense of entitlement. Here, the violation of privacy, something that should be a basic right, becomes an excuse for authority figures to step in as if a simple boundary is an act of criminality. The broader implications of this event lie in the way it highlights the persistent racial divides that exist in society. This is not an isolated event. Similar incidents occur every day, yet many go unnoticed or are dismissed as misunderstandings. However, the reality is that these so-called misunderstandings often have a far more damaging impact than we realize. In fact, what begins as a trivial issue quickly escalates into something far more significant, with potential consequences that affect not just the person involved, but the community at large. The question we must ask ourselves is why such events keep occurring. What does it say about a society where a black man can be treated with suspicion simply for asserting his right to privacy? How many others have been unfairly targeted in similar ways, their lives disrupted by people who believe they have the right to impose their will on others? This question doesn't just touch upon one individual's experience. It reflects an ongoing systemic issue that continues to impact the lives of people of color, often with little consequence for those in the wrong. Furthermore, this incident serves as a harsh reminder of how quickly situations can escalate when racial bias is involved. The very act of refusing to share personal information, something that anyone has the right to do, becomes a justification for involving the authorities. This is a pattern seen in countless instances of racial profiling, where people of color are treated differently simply because of their race, even in the most mundane of interactions. As we look at this story, it's essential to recognize that it is part of a much larger narrative. It's a story that echoes the experiences of many black individuals who find themselves in situations where their boundaries are disregarded, where their actions are questioned, and where they are forced to navigate a world that is far less forgiving than it should be. The reality is that incidents like this are not one-offs. They reflect a broader societal problem that continues to affect millions. The incident not only sheds light on the immediate dangers posed by racial profiling, but also calls attention to the greater issue of racial inequality and the systemic nature of such injustices. The fact that a black man, simply by asserting his right to privacy, finds himself the subject of a 911 call reveals much about how race continues to play a central role in shaping interactions in our society. The resulting escalation highlights the disparities in how people of color are treated compared to others, even in the most ordinary circumstances. This situation isn't just about the actions of one person, it's a reflection of a larger societal problem that requires collective awareness and change. As we explore this story, we are reminded of the importance of examining our own biases, questioning the systems that allow such behaviors to persist, and taking active steps toward creating a more just and equitable society. The hope is that by understanding these situations, we can start to change the narrative and ensure that no one else has to experience the same unfair treatment simply because they choose to stand up for their rights. The incident began with a seemingly simple interaction that escalated rapidly due to a demand for personal information. At its core, this was a situation about boundaries, specifically one man's right to protect his privacy. The black man in question was going about his day when a stranger, a woman, approached him. She demanded that he share his personal details, asking for information that under ordinary circumstances would be considered invasive and unwarranted. In a world where data privacy has become an increasingly hot topic, the man's refusal to provide such information was not just reasonable, it was his right. When he denied her request, the woman's response was swift and extreme. Instead of respecting his decision, she chose to escalate the matter. Rather than walking away or accepting that he simply wasn't comfortable sharing his personal details, she resorted to calling 911, attempting to turn a personal disagreement into a public matter. The situation quickly shifted from a mere exchange of words to a potential legal issue, simply because the woman could not accept that the man had every right to refuse. In her call, she described the man as suspicious, implying that his refusal was not just a matter of privacy, but something that warranted the involvement of law enforcement. By framing the interaction in a way that suggested a threat or danger, the woman attempted to paint a picture that was not grounded in reality. She relied on assumptions and stereotypes rather than acknowledging the man's right to make decisions about his own personal space. At this moment, the 911 call itself became the catalyst for escalating an otherwise innocuous interaction. The decision to call the authorities on someone for refusing to share their data highlights a deeper issue of entitlement and power dynamics. Instead of respecting boundaries, the woman chose to criminalize an ordinary action, reflecting a broader societal tendency to dismiss the autonomy of marginalized individuals. This wasn't about protecting anyone's safety. It was about asserting control over another person's privacy. As the 911 operator received the call, the situation was framed in a way that invited an official response. The man's actions, which were simply him asserting his privacy, were being presented as suspicious behavior deserving of police intervention. This moment marked the point where personal rights and public systems collided, showcasing how easily a misunderstanding, fueled by racial prejudice, can escalate into something far more dangerous. The core of the escalation lies in the fact that this was not a criminal matter. It was a simple boundary being asserted. However, the woman's actions turned it into an emergency, forcing law enforcement into a situation that, under different circumstances, would not have required their involvement. The issue was not about the man's behavior, but about the fact that his refusal to engage in a way that others found acceptable triggered a chain of events that was disproportionate to the situation. What's particularly telling about this incident is the way in which it mirrors so many others. It's not just about one person calling the police, it's about how easily certain individuals, particularly those who are not from marginalized communities, feel entitled to call upon the authority of the state to address personal discomfort. The man's refusal to share his information didn't warrant a police response, but for the woman involved, it was enough of an offense to make the call. In this context, the decision to involve the police wasn't based on any actual threat or crime. It was based on discomfort, an unwillingness to accept someone's boundaries, and a deep-seated belief that one person's right to privacy should not stand in the way of another's demands. This mindset is deeply problematic, especially when it leads to situations where marginalized individuals are subject to over-policing or unnecessary legal scrutiny. In summary, the moment the 911 call was made, the situation shifted from an ordinary interaction to something that could have serious consequences. The refusal to share personal information, a basic right that everyone should have, was transformed into a potential criminal act simply because one woman did not agree with the man's decision. This highlights a fundamental issue of entitlement, where the personal space and autonomy of certain individuals are disregarded in favor of someone else's discomfort or sense of entitlement. The 911 call was more than just a mistake. It was a symbol of how easily a situation can spiral out of control when boundaries are not respected and when racial assumptions cloud judgment. The emotional and psychological impact of such an incident on the black man involved cannot be overstated. When a person is simply trying to go about their day and is confronted with an unexpected situation, especially one fueled by racial bias, it can have lasting effects. The man in this case was subjected to a violation of his personal space and privacy, a right that should be universally respected. However, in this instance, his refusal to comply with a demand for his personal information was seen as something suspicious, something that required immediate intervention. For him, the refusal wasn't about confrontation, but about asserting his autonomy in a world where his rights are often questioned simply because of his skin color. The psychological toll of being unfairly targeted due to racial profiling is profound. In an instant, the man's sense of safety and security was shattered. What might have been an ordinary day for him became a moment where his very existence was questioned by a stranger who, in turn, escalated the situation to the authorities. This act was not just an inconvenience, it was a reminder of the everyday microaggressions and overt racism that people of color face. It's a constant reminder that, for many, their identity is often viewed through a lens of suspicion and distrust. In addition to the immediate emotional strain, the psychological impact of being racially profiled can linger long after the incident. The trauma of feeling unsafe or unwelcome in public spaces, something many black people experience frequently, is exhausting. It's not just about one incident, it's about the cumulative effect of being constantly placed in situations where one's rights are up for debate based on nothing more than appearance. This constant mental and emotional stress contributes to the anxiety and feelings of helplessness that many people of color carry with them, knowing that their every action is subject to scrutiny, often in ways that others would never face. Racial bias in such interactions does not just impact the individual involved. It also feeds into a larger cycle of racial tension in society. Every instance of racial profiling, every unfair treatment, contributes to the larger narrative of injustice that communities of color continue to experience. The black man's refusal to share his personal information was not an act of defiance, but rather an exercise in his basic right to privacy. However, in a racially biased society, his actions were misinterpreted, and he became a target simply for asserting his autonomy. This perpetuates a cycle of mistrust, division, and heightened racial tension, where people of color are forced to question whether their actions will be misunderstood or criminalized. This psychological burden goes beyond just this incident. It's the cumulative effect of being subjected to a society where one's race often dictates how they are treated, even in the most mundane of interactions. Each time an individual of color is confronted with these types of biases, it reinforces a sense of powerlessness, where the normal act of asserting one's rights becomes a battle to maintain dignity and respect in a system that often fails to provide both. This moment, small on the surface, carries with it the weight of centuries of inequality. reminding the man involved of the constant battle for respect and equality that many face every day. Personal boundaries are fundamental to maintaining a sense of self and ensuring the autonomy of individuals. At the core of any civil interaction is the respect for each person's right to control their own space, information, and decisions. The refusal to share personal information should never be treated as an act of defiance, nor should it be considered suspicious. In a society that values personal freedom and privacy, respecting these boundaries is not only a matter of individual rights, but also of mutual respect. The act of one person asserting their right to privacy is a simple yet powerful declaration of their autonomy in a world where others may try to impose their own expectations onto them. When these personal boundaries are violated, as seen in this incident, it speaks to a deeper societal issue. It is not just about one individual's refusal to share their information. It is about a broader pattern in which people, particularly marginalized individuals, are often expected to conform to others' demands. Whether it's about race, social, status, or gender, personal boundaries are often overlooked, especially when someone feels entitled to make decisions on behalf of another. This is the point at which personal space transforms into a battleground of societal expectations, power, dynamics, and cultural biases. Such moments reveal how easily societal norms can be distorted to justify control over another individual's life. What should be a basic interaction between two people quickly turns into a reflection of a larger systemic issue: how society often fails to respect the rights of individuals, particularly those from marginalized groups. The decision to involve the authorities over something as simple as asserting one's right to privacy demonstrates the inherent power imbalance in these kinds of interactions. It becomes less about the refusal to comply and more about the notion that one person feels they have the right to dictate the behavior of another. This concept of personal boundaries goes beyond privacy. It is a crucial part of maintaining dignity and respect in our everyday lives. Violating these boundaries, especially when it comes to people of color, highlights the deep-seated issues of racial prejudice and systemic inequality. These violations often go unnoticed by those who do not face them, but for those who do, the impact is profound. It's not just a single incident. It's a series of microaggressions and overt acts that continually remind marginalized individuals that their autonomy is often viewed as negotiable. In a society where personal boundaries are respected, individuals should feel safe to assert their rights without fear of repercussions. However, when those boundaries are continually crossed, whether through demands for personal information, unwarranted accusations, or racial profiling, the sense of security and autonomy diminishes. This is not only harmful to the individual, but also to the fabric of society, as it breeds an environment of fear, mistrust, and division. When personal boundaries are disrespected, it undermines the very principles of mutual respect and understanding that are necessary for a functioning society. Moreover, the failure to acknowledge and respect these boundaries contributes to a cycle of inequality, where certain individuals are consistently subjected to scrutiny, suspicion, and discomfort for simply existing. This not only affects personal well-being, but also perpetuates societal divisions, fostering an environment where individuals from marginalized communities are continually placed in situations where their dignity and autonomy are at risk. It is vital to recognize the importance of respecting boundaries, not just as a matter of personal interaction, but as a cornerstone of a just and equitable society. When we look at the broader implications of this incident, it becomes clear that the refusal to share personal information was not just a singular act. It was a stand for privacy, autonomy, and respect. The failure to acknowledge this right and the decision to escalate the situation speaks to a much larger issue of how personal rights are often undermined in a society that struggles to fully respect the boundaries of marginalized groups. Understanding and respecting personal boundaries is not just a moral duty. It is a necessary step toward creating a more inclusive and respectful society. By addressing these broader issues, we can begin to challenge the status quo and work toward a future where every individual's right to privacy and dignity is truly upheld. When the police were called, the situation reached a point where an unnecessary intervention threatened to escalate a routine encounter into something far more serious. The authorities arrived not to resolve a real crime, but to address a dispute that was based on a refusal to share personal information. This was an unfortunate reality for the black man involved, who was now subject to a level of scrutiny and potential legal ramifications for simply asserting his right to privacy. The police were put in a position where they had to act, despite the absence of any legitimate threat or criminal behavior. This action highlights how quickly seemingly trivial matters can be transformed into life-altering events when race and bias are involved. The consequences of such an incident extend far beyond the immediate emotional and psychological toll on the individual involved. The act of calling the police based on racial assumptions or discomfort can lead to an escalation of racial profiling, an over-policing of marginalized communities, and a general mistrust of law enforcement. These situations serve as stark reminders of the racial divides that persist in society, often exacerbated by biases that fuel discriminatory actions. For many, these kinds of incidents are part of a much larger pattern, one where people of color find themselves treated with suspicion, their personal rights disregarded, and their autonomy questioned. This incident serves as a call to action for both individuals and society as a whole. It challenges us to reflect on how our beliefs and actions may contribute to a culture of discrimination, even if unintentionally. The woman's decision to call the police over the refusal to share personal information was rooted in entitlement and a disregard for boundaries. In turn, this action placed the black man involved at risk, further perpetuating the cycle of racial injustice. For society to progress, it is crucial that we examine our own biases, question assumptions, and strive for greater empathy and respect for the rights of others. The broader implications for racial justice cannot be ignored. Every time an incident like this occurs, it reinforces the message that people of color are viewed through a lens of suspicion, and their rights are not always protected. It underscores the need for systemic change, whether in the way law enforcement responds to situations involving people of color, or in how individuals address the biases and assumptions they carry. This story is not just a moment in one individual's life. It is a reflection of a larger societal issue that requires collective awareness and action. To drive change, we must challenge ourselves and each other to be more mindful of the way we treat others. We must actively work to dismantle the systems and structures that enable racial bias to persist, and we must foster an environment where personal boundaries are respected, regardless of race. As individuals, we can begin by reflecting on our own behaviors and confronting the biases that we might not even be aware of. As a society, we need to push for accountability, understanding, and meaningful reform in the way racial justice is addressed both within law enforcement and in everyday interactions. Ultimately, the incident serves as a reminder that change begins with awareness. It is our collective responsibility to ensure that the lessons learned from such incidents are used to fuel progress, not perpetuate injustice. The call for awareness and change is not just about what happens after an incident occurs. It is about preventing future occurrences by fostering a culture of respect, empathy, and equality. The more we confront these uncomfortable truths, the closer we come to creating a society where personal boundaries are respected and where racial justice is not just an aspiration, but a reality. Join the conversation and stand up for justice. Subscribe to the Hoa Stories for more powerful stories and insights.